Welcome to Revisiting Dr. King's Dream, Economic Equality. My name is Ingrid LaFleur. I'm the Chief Community Officer with EOS Detroit. EOS Detroit is a block producer for the blockchain EOS and a couple other sister chains. And we're going to get a little bit into blockchain technology for those of you who don't know about it. But we're going to first want to dive into our economy and the forces within the economy that are creating this poverty cycle that is never ending and that is leaving this legacy for us of fighting to end it. And as all of us know, there have been many, many people who have been focusing on ending poverty. But today we're going to focus on Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign. But before I do that, I just want to thank the Scarab Club. We are in this really beautiful historical space. Who's been here before? Sweet. For those of you who haven't, this is a private club that was created early 19. Wonderful, amazing artists, and it has a really amazing, beautiful legacy. And it would be a great place to have a conversation about how we can gather together, create, imagine, and build. And that's what Scarab Club kind of represents. I just want to recognize the people who are part of EOS Detroit. Please raise your hand. There's many of us here. This is all the part of the team. Thank you guys so much for make this happen. So this is a co-creation session, which I said before, everyone here is an expert. I did not want to create a panel discussion. I really wanted to hear from people and hear about your ideas. I know a lot of us are thinking about it. We're affected by it. If you live in Detroit, you see it every single day. We can't avoid it. Poverty is present, and it's affecting any sort of growth that we are looking towards. So in 1968, Dr. King had this wonderful dream of, or actually 1967, of creating this Poor People's Campaign to finally tackle the one major issue that he had been actually focusing on throughout his activist career. So this was to unite all of the races and to really build a campaign that would kind of push government to create certain rights, economic rights that everybody would have access to, and in order to improve our quality of life. So part of the things that they were petitioning to create was a $30 billion annual appropriation for real war on poverty, on congressional passage of full employment and guaranteed income legislation, a guaranteed annual wage is what they were looking at, construction of 500,000 low-cost housing units per year until slums were eliminated. They wanted to have this economic bill of rights, and the campaign was supposed to happen in 3 phases. I'm just saying this because I've always heard about the Poor People's Campaign, but I didn't know about these wonderful details, and I find it kind of fascinating. So the first thing was to create like a kind of like a camp called a Resurrection City on the National Mall. And it was supposed to house about 3,000 people. And then the next phase was to create these mass public demonstrations and protests throughout the country. And then the third phase was to start boycotting major industries and shopping areas to push the business leaders to pressure Congress for the campaign. They were only able to, because Dr. King was assassinated, the Poor People's Campaign was not fully realized, but they were able to kind of have this climactic moment during the Solidarity Day rally for jobs, peace, and freedom in June 1968, where 50,000 people joined the 3,000 participants living in the Resurrection City. So this was like the biggest massive moment for the Poor People's Campaign. And it has since kind of been put on hold as a result of that. And so this conversation that I wanted to have was thinking about Dr. King's dream. It is also the 400th anniversary of the first slaves, African slaves coming to Jamestown. And so just thinking about all of these kind of markers and what does that mean today? And how the economic injustice of many people, especially Black people, Latinos, women, have been dealing with poverty throughout this entire time. It hasn't actually really changed. Today, the Black poverty rate remains more than twice as high as the white poverty rate. The same as in 1968 is the same as it is today. So right now, we're dealing with 82% of all wealth created in last year went to the top 1%, and nothing went to the 50%. And then the poverty rate, I'll just go through this really quickly so we have an understanding of where we're at. So a poverty rate, about 1 in 8 Americans live below the poverty line, which is about $25,000 for a family of 4. So the poverty rate in 2017 was 12%, which is about 39.7 million people. Between 2016 and 2017, people with at least a bachelor's degree were the only group to have an increase in poverty rate or the number of people in poverty. So education is not necessarily, the safety net. I like to talk about the working poor as well because I think we kind of skip over that, and it really frustrates me that people are working like we're told to do, and we're still struggling. And we can't make all our bills and all the basic needs necessary. So there's 7.6 million individuals who are considered working poor in 2016. And the working poor are people who spent at least 27 weeks in the labor force, but whose income still fell below the poverty line. In Michigan, 1 in 5 kids in Michigan lives in poverty. And in Detroit, we might already know about this, 60% of our youth are in poverty. If you add the working poor, we are 64% in poverty. So that's over half of our city. And it's definitely an urgent moment that we're in right now. So finally, the last thing that I just want to put out is the government shutdown. We're on day 34. And that means that about 800,000 people are either working without pay or not working. Food stamps were given out a month ahead, for those who might not know about that. And so those food stamps, the average is about $123 a month. Can you imagine? For food a month. And so they've already gotten their February allotment, so we don't really know. If they don't resolve it, March is coming, and it's coming soon. And what does that mean, and are we prepared? And this is what I think about when it comes to economic resiliency. Are we prepared for these kind of unforeseeable forces to enter our lives and to change things? You know, people had these 9-to-5s. They're working for the federal government with more security than that, right? Isn't that what you're told? And now we are on day 34 with no salary. So I want to begin with a series of questions, and I just love for everyone to just kind of jump in with any ideas that you may have. I first want to explore, what does economic equality even look like? I read an article recently, and they were saying that we probably shouldn't even use that phrase because the Democrats are making it a goal, and that's hard to imagine. Like, what does that goal even really look like? I think we understand in civil rights that means that certain people need the right to vote, right? It's very clean and clear. But something about economic equality, it gets a little crazy. So I'm curious from you, and please speak into the mic so then people can hear you, unless you don't want to be heard. What does economic equality look like to you?
I think reparations. I had read an article maybe a year ago, and it said that the average white family has 22 more times the wealth than the average black family. Um, the only way we can have something that's equal is if the wealth that already exists is redistributed. And I think that comes through reparations. No. It would change the world.
Me. Hey. Um Maybe jumping the gun a bit, but I think it's not so much about I think the key to that would be rede- redefining what wealth is or what not just defining economic equality, but what economy is, what wealth is, what money is, what value is. Um, once you redefine that, right now it's loosely sort of based on generally property ownership, right? Um, if you redefine that as the value and put your value someplace else, then talking about where you're equal in the economy sort of shifts and your dynamic shift and the question shifts and how you get there sort of shifts because um, while things like reparations and things in theory sound good and work, it's how do you there are the haves and the haves nots, how do you get it from the haves? That's the trick. That's what's always held it up. And minus violent actions and overthrowing things, you got to figure out a different way. And I think the easiest way is redefining what money is. That's not like something I can verbalize. I don't know. I think it's a big question. If I had an easy answer for that, I'd probably have a Nobel Prize and we'd be all sharing in that. Um, but in its basis, though, it's almost redefining. Uh, well, it's deciding how you want to define things like ownership and defining how what money is or where it's created from. Right? It's gone through phases over the past several thousand years. We've turned into sort of a centrally controlled World Bank or government or corporate sponsored money system. So sort of redefining that to where it works for the majority and not for the minority as much.
Good evening, everyone. Dr. Ken Harris. Pleasure to be here. This topic was extremely attractive. What your question pertains to? What is economic equality? There is no economic equality. This country was founded uh, owing a debt. That debt has never been paid. The terms of equality have been used to subjugate what I believe as a diversity delusion agenda, um, built on the backs of which we can now trace through data um, the promises that have never came true. The Democratic, the Republican parties have never uh, issued policy to effectuate the circumstances of black people. White supremacy in context has never alluded the fact of inclusion to the point to where post-slavery we were promised 40 acres and a mule. We were given a Freedmen's Bank which crashed. Post-Freedmen's Bank, we participated in what we thought would be equal opportunity. That equal opportunity led to Jim Crow segregation. From Jim Crow segregation, we went through all types of torture and lynchings every time any black person tried to enter the economic mainstream of society. They gave us politics, education, and every other social illusion you can think of to keep us away from the economic infrastructure. And this country realizes exactly what it's doing to subjugate not just black people, but now people of class, mixed in with the racial tensions that exist to confuse its original sin, which was slavery, built as the foundation for the economic power that it is today. So they mask over things like civil half rights or affirmative half action, and put in place things that never equal economic opportunity. So to me, it's a myth. There is no equality. The debt hasn't been paid, and history shows that it will never be paid until there is an uprising of both the class poor people of this country and the original folks who were effectuated and built this country off their backs, which were black people. And the confusion of race used as a caste system to separate black and brown, such as we all know now that skeletons are coming up, where the data suggests that not only were black people indigenous to this country thousands of years before the mixture of Asians and black people to create Indians, but everything comes from Africa. And so when we realize what the root is and where we are today, that is what the hidden knowledge is that these people will always be subjugated to white supremacy as long as white supremacy controls the political, social, economic conditions of this country.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I believe it's also mental. Like, even though we went through all of that, we still have the power now, I believe, to stop relying on the government. I think this shutdown is really going to help open a lot of people's eyes and realize that we don't need to rely on the government for assistance and all of that. But we really need to start building our own, like, if people can, you know what I'm saying, as far as like feeding themselves, that's one of the big things. You work to feed and have, a roof over your head. But if you can feed yourself by planting, or, we all had our own gardens or farms, and we can just have our own little markets in, Detroit, I think that could help, you know what I'm saying, as far as spreading at least wealth and, I guess, just helping people, as far as them not relying on food stamps and all this other crap that can be taken away from them at any time. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So I would say we just have to figure out a way to go around the government to, help ourselves.
I just have some comments to follow up on this gentleman's thoughts about an alternative to our economic system that's based upon possessions. I think we have a lot that we could learn from the indigenous tribal people that still live in community today. There's not a lot of them around the globe, but I read an interesting story where a sociologist from England went and lived in one of these tribal communities, and for a period of time came back a year later and actually brought a couple of the folks from the tribe to England. And they're flying into England, and they were amazed at just the scenery coming in from the plane, and their questions had to do with the tallest buildings. So we went through a period of time where the tallest buildings in the world were houses of worship, and those were our tallest buildings, and they've been replaced with um, banks, and skyscrapers that are monuments to financial and to money, right? Instead of a higher power. So try to wrap it up here, but my point is that these guys are observing now a way of life that we consider to be common around the world, and like where do you go all day? He's like, well, I go to work. Why do you go to work? Like, what are you doing? He's like, well, I got to earn this paycheck to buy stuff, right, for my family, pay for this house, pay for this mortgage. And they're like, well, where we come from, somebody needs a place to live, we all get together and we build them a house, and they just take care of one another, right? That sense of community, I think, would be an alternative. How do we turn back the clock on this? I don't know, but to me, what's amazing is that we have this 1% of the 1% that controls all of this, right? So how can we, 99%, not organize effectively, rise up to be able to use the sheer power of the people and the numbers that we have to make some social change? Obviously, it's a difficult question, or we would have come up with the answer by now. But Bono is got this organization that talks about eradicating poverty across the globe, right? And says that capitalism, while it's flawed, has also gotten more people out of poverty than any other institution. Well, did the capitalism create the poverty in the first place, right? So there's lots of fundamental, I think, questions that we can ask and uncover. Don't have solutions, just have some thoughts.
Uh, it always gets real awkward when people talk about economic equality from either a consumerist point of view or a policy point of view, um, or an educational point of view. Because a lot of times I think about the conditions of our our infrastructure. And cool thing is about other countries, they can skip over the technologies that govern our infrastructure. I mean, hoverboards aren't real yet, but we should be close soon. Um, and so they won't need roads to transport goods and individuals. Um, the the wealthiest people in the world are responsible for the livelihoods of lots and lots and lots and lots of people. Most of the large corporations have more owners than they have employees. I don't know if a lot of people think about it like that, but if I'm responsible for the owners of my company, I'm going to do what they say before I do what the employees of my company say. Um, right, because they have the ability to fire me, and if I'm earning 50 times more than my employees, I'm going to answer the people who cut my paycheck. Um, but when we look at our needs, we don't look at the people who do the labor of meeting our needs. Our roads and bridges are FUBAR because we don't know how to talk to the people who do that work. Not because somebody else won't pay for it. Our houses need roofs and plumbing, not because somebody's not willing to do the work. It's because we don't know how to talk to them. The first thing that comes out of our mouths is how much does it cost? Instead of maybe I could take these chickens in the backyard and I can feed your family. Or maybe I can, help you with what I have, but most of us have nothing to trade except for lip service. I know people who have matriculated college and still can't change a tire. um, Economic equality means that you look at the person across from you equally. Um, the highest demand in the United States is in the labor force. Carpenters, millwrights, metal workers, we need them. And they don't have to be nice to us because they can spend 3 years in a trade union and they can earn more than a teacher will earn in their entire lives. We value athletes and entertainers far more than we value people like Mark Dean, Percy Julian, Elijah McCoy, the woman who invented the corn broom. um, and the same minds that create this technology are the same minds that we raise. And then they go work for the people that we consider our enemy. When you think about it, we bullied them, we mistreat them, and then they go work for these corporations and with our blessings, and they create weapons against us because we don't have a rapport with these minds, and we get jacked every time, every turn, and we deserve it. We don't feel like we deserve it, but if the shoes that you wear, if the people in your community can't make those shoes because it's unhealthy, because it will cause a woman who glues the leather to the soles of of her shoes to give birth to children that have birth defects, and you still wear them, you deserve to be at least horsewhipped, if not. And we have to think about it as consumers. What are we going to do for the people that do for us? They are eliminating those people from every aspect of commerce, every aspect of trade. Pretty soon you'll go to the hospital and you'll deal with a robot. You're already doing it when you go to get money out of the bank or when you go to the grocery store. You're not dealing with human beings anymore. And we talk about relationships, but I promise you, the person who makes your shoes don't know you. And if you knew them, you wouldn't buy the shoes that they make. Because Nike, and I don't care that they own Converse, killing people, and I'm getting mine for $8,000 on what is it, Exchange X, whatever it is,
StockX.
StockX. Okay, but how many people go, yeah, I'm a murderer, and I'm just like my president because I do not care about human beings. If you don't care about human beings are not obligated to care about you. People take a dump in your spinach, and you deserve it because you're not going to protest like the Molly Maid or whatever it is, Auntie M, or the company that have these slave labor people growing spinach in California when they steal water from other states because they don't have fresh water. And the technology that will allow those shifts to happen is something that we are ignoring. And as long as we ignore those people, they will harm us. You got to look at them as the enemy and put one in their forehead out of mercy, or you got to sit down and you got to have some discussions with them because there's nothing else that you can do.
Awesome. Thank you, Ulysses. I just wanted, I find it interesting your statement about having to look at someone equally is what economic equality requires. And as we all know, that's not going to happen in our lifetime or even our children's lifetime. That requires such a deep shift in consciousness. So I'm excited to talk about later about the mechanisms for which we can skip over waiting for humans to actually recognize other humans as equal, because that will take too long.
Part of the problem.
I'm
part of the problem.
You're proud of the problem? All right, Bilal, break it down.
Something I've seen over the past week, or the past year, or probably the past two, because I've been living in Palestine while working in Israel, and like what I concluded from that is that the only difference between Ramallah and Tel Aviv and what Winfield and Detroit is that one actually has a physical barrier splitting the two people. And the fact that I see the same situation over here, like I came back with them as well. And at first I was like in denial, everything kind of freaking out, just I didn't even know. But the more that I actually face it, is like I can't pretend that I don't see what I do see. And when I pretend that I won't even say pretend, when I forget the privilege I was born into, and I realize that we do nothing for our cities, we do like coming from like a like decently wealthy family. What I see, like what I really see is that they don't see it. They don't even see it. Yeah, wait. Yeah, yeah. Wait. Oh, the mic's on. Oh my God. Oh, because I was sitting. All right, sweet. All right. My bad. I spaced out into my thing. Yeah. So I'm trying to learn to like actually be more present, because sometimes I feel like a robot, and I forget that I have a heart. And sometimes I'm an asshole without even meaning to be. And just I'm really sick of it. Just I like the fact that I go into my grandparents' basement and I just see like all these closets full of clothes that for some reason we keep saying we're gonna donate or whatever, but whenever I come back after I put them in the bags or whatever, they're still there. So I really want to like I just want to help is what I'm concluding from everything. I just want to help. The fact is I have so much to learn about like my own craft, you know, and like we are all one. And whenever I pretend that we're not, when I start losing my mind. And thank
So
you so much
yeah,
for listening to me.
well, I think you introduced something really interesting. When in these conversations, we rarely talk about our own wealth, what that means, and on a very personal, intimate, individual level. Thank you for sharing that and being vulnerable enough to do so. Yeah. Brandon, where's the mic?
So I wanted to just sort of bring to the forefront two major questions that seem to be sort of maybe absent from conversations about what equality looks like, particularly economic equality. I think one of the things missing is whose standard of equality are we talking about? And another piece that's missing is the differences in quality itself. Like, so what does a good standard of living mean for what a good standard of living might mean for me might in fact be different from what a good or equal standard of living might mean for you. And I think people aren't really talking about that. Like, all of us have probably different meanings of what a good life means. But, and here we are trying to all talk about what is economic equality. But we haven't come to sort of an operational agreement about what equality is itself. So I think that sort of poses sort of an intrinsic issue for the discussion itself, because each of us has varying ideas about what it means for us to live equally. So that's one thing that I don't see being addressed. Secondarily, um, how many models of economic equality do we have to even draw from? That's another piece that seems to be very absent. Nobody in these discussions is saying, hey, let's look at this culture or this community. Not to say that they don't exist, but they don't seem to be sort of a reference point for us to start this discussion. Instead, what seems to be a reference point is actually nothing. We're just kind of out of the air discussing what this could look like. And not only are we discussing it out of the air, we're discussing it in the context of living in a capitalist society as Americans and all of the things that come with that, and trying to sort of have a conversation outside of that, which is also very difficult, especially from the standpoint of trying to reach a resolution, seriously reach a resolution, other than just kind of having discussions for the sake of discussion. So those are two things that I think that we might do well to give more consideration to, what our collective idea of equality might look like. And then can we, even some discussion of how strongly can we identify what economic equality looks like in the first place as people who live in a context that, for most, I don't know everybody's history, but I've lived in America since I was born. How well equipped am I to even really discuss economic equality from my particular standpoint?
Or even imagine it. You don't think you have the ability to try and imagine what that would look like?
Not saying that I don't have the ability to imagine it, but I think that it's worth all of us sort of discussing our abilities or lack thereof, or you know, propensity to do it well. Right, right. Like, I feel like we sort of start from a baseline idea that, hey, everybody here is equipped to really talk about this. And I think that sometimes when you got a lot of people who might not necessarily be well equipped, who might not necessarily recognize their biases, who might not necessarily recognize any number of factors that might prevent them from being serious considerers, I guess, for lack of a better term, but serious people to consider this issue, we don't really tackle that. We kind of enter the discussion as if everybody is equally prepared to talk the talk. And I feel like we don't really say, okay, who's prepared, what level of preparation is necessary for a serious discussion of this. If we don't have that certain level of preparation, are we just spinning our wheels?
I so For me, when I talk about economic equality, I'm thinking about everybody having basic needs met: fresh, clean water, fresh, clean food, um, safe shelter with all of the necessary, like heat, air conditioning, uh, and and the ability and access to things like a really good education, safe public transportation. I think all of the things that kind of help make the world go round. The rest of it, to me, is very personal, and it can be cultural, and that is up to the individual. Um, but I really don't want to see any more homeless people. When I'm in San Francisco, I think it's just completely outrageous. Shame on all of those wealthy people living in San Francisco. I have never seen so many homeless people in my life. We're supposedly like, Detroit, we are 64% poverty, but I see more homeless people when I'm in San Francisco than I do in Detroit. Thankfully. Yeah. Yeah. And right, exactly. Um, so I'm going to take two more comments, and then I was going to go into phase two.
Thank you so much for putting this together. Yeah, this is so Brandon and I just came from the Grio, and we were having a conversation. I was telling him about my weekend. I just got back from a retreat in Lake Tahoe with 50 remarkably impressive people, most of whom lived in San Francisco in the tech industry. A friend of mine put this together. It was I feel incredibly blessed to have been able to participate, but I can't help but I spent the weekend reflecting on basically like holy crap, this is a group of exceptionally accomplished and impressive people, but also wow, I feel lucky to live in a community where I have a grounding, where I'm grounded, and have my, able to be connected to how a vast majority of human beings actually live. The issues and the the things that were being discussed, while many of them very kind of forward-thinking and progressive, it was really cool to hear about. But I think there's a gross misunderstanding of what a majority of humans are dealing with today, that exists in San Francisco. And I think there's kind of this I'm in the tech industry in Detroit. There's this infatuation with San Francisco being this utopia, but in reality, like, man, do they have, there's aspects of it like the access to capital and mentorship. There's aspects of it that are clearly advantageous, but wow, are they missing the boat on a lot of things that I think our community really has our ear to the ground and is really tapping into, which I think is a really beautiful thing. So first of all, thank you for everybody being in this room. Just real quickly, just playing off of what Brendan just said and what Ingrid's getting at here, I'm thinking a lot about I appreciate you clarifying that you're talking about basic needs being met, and I'm excited to talk about universal basic income and these different concepts that we're talking about here. I think my man who was talking about being stuck on food stamps, that type of thing. I think a lot of the systems in our country that have really good intentions, have really adverse consequences, like causing people to be dependent, for example. Whereas a system like a universal basic income has the potential to change those incentives such that remove the disincentive to continue growing, which I think is really beautiful. And I won't go into more detail. I'll let Ingrid take that one. And then just the very last thing that I want to say is that I think it's really important that as we're having this conversation that we really take time to deeply reflect on whether we're talking about equality of opportunity or if we're talking about equality of outcome. I think especially when we think about when we're reflecting on economic systems at kind of the highest level, from my perspective, and I encourage people to disagree with me, I think it's really important that we keep our eye on the ball, focusing on equality of opportunity, so long as basic needs are being met. I think that's the balance that needs to be met. So creating the conditions necessary to allow human beings to self-actualize, not trying to correct after the fact and make sure that everyone ends up exactly the same, because everyone has a different definition of success. So the important part is creating the conditions to allow people to meet their own definition of success, rather than having, for example, a government trying to dictate what success looks like for all the individual people, because we've tried that a number of times throughout history and it hasn't worked out so well. So I'm really interested in this question of what types of systems can we use to help even the playing field with regards to opportunity. And I appreciate everyone for being in this conversation and for
Awesome.
including me.
If you guys don't mind, I just want to introduce universal basic income since he already brought it up real quick. And then we can continue the conversation. So I don't know how many of you know about what's happening in Stockton, California. Yes. We have Stockton has this mayor. I think he's like in his mid 30s. Mayor Michael Tubbs, and he proposed a universal basic income when he ran, and so now that project is underway. They in Stockton, it's 300,000 people. 1 in 4 are living in poverty. And so this UBI, Universal Basic Income project, is under the Economic Security Project. The co-founder of Facebook, Chris Hughes, that's his thing, Economic Security Project. And so what was I going to say? The median income for Stockton is $49,000 compared to $57,000 nationally. But it's seen in this article, it was like there are the highest number of foreclosures, I guess, in the area, and they've just dealt with a lot of economically devastating things, and they're like literally right next to Silicon Valley. So it's great that Silicon Valley is like, sure, we're going to help with it. Well, not Silicon Valley, but Chris Hughes, through his project is going to help create this universal basic income project. This is a really exciting thing. We should keep our eyes on it, because if it's successful, and it's going to roll out for a number of years, but if it's successful, then hopefully we can have that in other places in the United States. They're in India. I really like this example. They're going to create a universal basic income, or there's a party that really is advocating for it. They have 610,000 citizens that they're going to be doing this. And it's in Sikkim. And apparently they banned plastic bags there. They eliminated the use of pesticides and fertilizers in this particular state. The literacy rate is 98%. And they've reduced the percentage of people living below the poverty line to 8%, compared to 30% nationally in India. And so they think it's a really good idea because of the low population density and the small geographic area. So it just got me thinking about Detroit as a result of that. What they're going to use is hydropower. So Sikkim sells 90% of their hydropower. The state produces 2,200 megawatts. And they only need 200 to 300 megawatts, so they sell the rest. So the idea is that the money from selling the rest of the power would go to create this universal basic income. But they haven't decided exactly like how much it is going to be a month. And I felt like I had another example. But yeah, those are two like pretty good examples. There was that's what it was. Finland. When you asked about examples of what does equality look like, immediately I went to Denmark earlier. I went to Denmark last year. And Denmark had been coming up quite a bit because of the way that they structure kind of like the social support. So even when you're unemployed, you get paid in that transition period. So, I mean, you get paid, but like if you get a job and there's like a level of transition that we don't have. Like, I don't know if you know that. If you're unemployed, you get a job and you get off of it, right? So they have that transition point. I think you not only is university free, but you get paid to go. Every child gets or every family gets a certain amount of money. They get so much money that they actually just save it. And since they don't have to pay for college, they just really save this money to invest act any way that they want. This is a hyper wealthy kind of situation, and it's based on oil in Denmark. But in Finland, they did try a UBI project, but they did it for a really short period of time. So when you look at UBI projects, make sure that you see if it's for a certain number of years or if it's really short. If it's really short and they say it failed, it's because they didn't do it long enough, and they probably didn't have a full understanding of how a UBI system works. So Finland project was ended, but it was very political. And then they advocated for it in Switzerland. That didn't go through, which I'm kind of surprised. Switzerland's pretty wealthy. So they definitely have the money for it. But UBI seems to be like the way that a lot of people are going. And I would love to hear your thoughts in addition to whatever thoughts you had previously. Where is the other mic? Okay. Can we move it this way? Kennard had something. And then who are the other people? I saw multiple.
I was just going to say, universal basic income is great, but we right now can't even give universal basic education. And universal basic education, to me, is more important. UBI is kind of like paying people off to accept what they're given. We want people to be really equal. They have to have equal opportunity. And then they can live the life they want to live. And then universal basic income comes in to make sure that you can choose to be a police officer and not live in poverty. Choose to be a teacher or a social worker and still not live at a substandard quality of life like you would if you chose to be an engineer or a banker. So I think, it's great to say universal income, but we need to start with the basics, which is educating people. Our state right now is so dysfunctional. We have everybody squabbling about, we're fighting district against district for the money. And people don't care that there are children out there who aren't being taught how to have a basic life. And, to talk about universal income is great, but we aren't even getting to the basics, which is equal education.
There is someone else who advocates for universal basic resources, and education would fall underneath that. Healthcare, parks, and things of that sort. Can we move the mic to Kennard?
I was actually going to say, I actually think that economic equality is like a red herring. I think that if you think about it, if someone creates something new, like a new tool, and that tool lets them get the work that they would get done in a week done in a day, they are now wealthier because they created that, and that creates a difference, right, in wealth. And I think the problem with how we conceptualize equality is that, one mechanism by which people might become economically equal is that if there's someone who's charging way ahead and you pull that person back to the middle, everyone's on the same line, right? And I think that that's not what we want to do. And I think, Ingrid, you touched on this. Really what we want to do is eliminate poverty and eliminate exploitation. And I think that you will still have people who are creating new wealth, and it makes sense that when you create new wealth, there's a new differential in wealth. So I think the real issue isn't equality or inequality. It's actually consensuality, that we are forced to participate in a system that holds us down. And I think the key is actually being able to leave that system and to only participate in systems that are consensual. And I think it's kind of like, rather than saying you're going too far ahead, you need to come back to the group. What we really need is for everyone to be able to go in the direction that they want to go in, essentially self-actualize. And I think someone earlier said, like, the only way to achieve this is uprising. I actually don't think that's true. I think there's actually a better alternative, and that's exodus. Us being able to leave the system that's holding us down and to create new systems that lift us up and take us where we want to go. So I think like that's like a really like key point, that it's actually not like in my opinion, it's actually not inequality that's the problem. I mean, there's so many systems; they're all like tangled up together. Um, I mean, so I mean, I think the most important thing is actually overcoming our own selves, and when we do that, I think we reach a level where we are uh, sort of you kind of have to reach a level where you are not only self-empowering, but you're empowering those around you in an interdependent way, where you pass independence and you go up to interdependence. um, and I think that the number of systems, like a lot of people, I think in this room and really around the world, would probably say it's capitalism, sure. But like personally, one thing I think about is not having like linguistic sovereignty. Like a lot of people think like the man is keeping you down with his words, right? Like it's all those terms and those contracts and that being leveraged against you and the differentials in literacy. But I tend to think maybe the man is keeping you down not with his words but with the letters. It even goes down to the level of the letters. Like where did the alphabet come from? Like why do you use this? You think your thoughts in this system. Maybe this is the primary system and not capitalism. Capitalism can't really exist outside of language, can it? So I think all of the systems are tied up with each other, but the keystone is always yeah. Yeah, I mean, but I think yeah. So, but I think the keystone is always going to be your own self. That's the ultimate system, and yeah, that's my perspective. Yeah, for sure.
wanted to make a comment. You had mentioned something about like leaving the systems or something, and then he asked, "Okay, what system are you talking about?" It just came to my mind like the legal system, because I know Wayne County Jail is just full of people who I think 80 or 90% of them have a mental health disorder or a substance use disorder or some low-level felony, so that when they come out, they can't re-enter society because there's no chance for them while they're in jail or in prison to get rehabilitated at all. So I mean, that was just one thing. The legal system is just working against the people, and so I just wanted to put that out there. I don't have any solutions. I came here today to hear ideas, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. That is so true. Learning about when prisoners are finally released and they come back into the system, if they are felonies, if they have a felony, then they won't be able to stay in public housing. They won't be able to have access to certain education opportunities. And the list goes on and on and on and on and on. So there is that barrier. A lot of people are that's something that I discussed when I was running for mayor a while back, that, people are desperate, and that's why, we have crime. This is why the crime keeps going up. People are trying to feed their families or figure out a way out of this poverty system, and they might use illegal means, and then they go into that system, and that just sets things back even further. So, and that's part of the cycle. Rob?
Hi, everyone. What a wonderful discussion. Thank you all. I totally agree with what Kennard was saying on a number of levels. I just kind of wanted to dive into that. So I think the system, the boogeyman I want to attack is the monetary system. It's, to me, the seat of power for both political power and corporate power. And it's the mechanism that has allowed very insidiously in access to opportunities, which is also my personal definition for economic equality, creating a field where everyone can have a shot and the odds aren't stacked against you from day one. That's the mechanism I think that really needs to be, exodus from. And so I think that there's a paradox here, going off of what you mentioned about the cashless society. And the fact that technology can be the movement. We can create our own monetary systems and our own economies in parallel outside of the existing system, but we need enough people to start that. So we need a little snowball effect to start, and we do need to make sure that that system is a system that can be evolved and also one that doesn't have side effects. So to me, I don't know if digital currency is necessarily as bad as Venmo. Because a corporation controls Venmo, but if we're doing digital currency right, each of us still retains some control. There is the transparency versus privacy dilemma, which is a whole other meetup circle discussion. We don't need to go into that too deep, but I personally also, on the topic of UBI, I don't trust the state to do it right. They have not proven themselves to me during my lifetime as an American. And there's a lot, and I'm a white guy who has been privileged. I'll definitely say that. So there's so many people who get it way worse. And from my perspective, I don't think they do it right. So there's really interesting corollaries in digital currency or this new technology movement, the blockchain technology, of how could we do without a state? How could we reallocate resources and give everyone a fair chance without a state? Because the state also implies force and use of violence to enforce laws. So if you're seeking solutions outside of the brute force approach of an uprising, a violent uprising, I don't think involving the state at all is going to end in a good story. But pragmatically, there are definitely concessions that we can move towards to help the state be less perverse and oppressive and violent. And that's also important to do pragmatically during our lifetime. But if we're talking ideally, um, so this segs into URI, which is the corollary I mentioned, universal resource inheritance. Did you want to bring that up later, or should I go? Okay. So essentially, universal resource inheritance is a concept that is essentially, if you're not making your capital productive, then you should be diluted over time. So anyone who's sitting on resources idly, not using them, gets diluted over their lifetime, and that dilution is redistributed back to everybody. So everybody continually gets something. That something could potentially meet basic needs. I don't know how all the unit economics, all the details work out, because these are very complicated systems that have so many variables and so many people involved. But that's the gist. So the idea is, it's actually interesting because it's still free market driven. It still kind of has certain aspects of capitalism where everyone may have an incentive to try really hard to do something, to innovate, to work hard, which is one thing that could be said capitalism gets right, is the incentive to create or produce. But the thing it gets wrong, as far as I'm concerned, is the total lack of concern for basic needs of people. So with URI and concepts like that haven't been tested yet, we don't have the violence of the state enforcing the redistribution mechanism, and I'm really excited for it. We're not there yet. No one's really put this out into the wild, but I wouldn't be surprised if we saw it within 2 years. Sure. Right. Yeah, it's not going to fix social issues. Right, yeah. And it's interesting. So Dan's more grounded in libertarian and like free market Austrian economics would be the proper term. So that's kind of the basis of his economy, whereas or his economic thoughts. Yeah. Yep. So the current economy is based on a model called Keynesian economics. And that's kind of, if you go to school for economics, you learn about that. But there's other philosophies of economics that don't get as much attention. And Austrian economics is one school. There's the Chicago School of Economics, and I'm sure there's other ideas as well, which I think Kennard, you might have been at the meetup, or Ingrid, you went. Radical Markets meetup was talking about, using. I don't even remember the name. It's a whole other study, economic study. So there's all of these different philosophy. Economics is philosophy almost, or in some sense. So, anywho, what I was getting at was, oh yeah, you wanted me to go into URI. Yeah. So the idea behind URI and how it could sustain over time is universal resource inheritance. The idea is everyone gets one share of the earth for existing. So because you're a human, you get a claim to some of the redistribution. But the redistribution is done through an inflation as opposed to levying tax and redistributing that, which UBI that's the mechanism for that. And so there's some interesting blogs you could read a little deeper there on that one. But I think that the point you were getting at or wanting me to clarify was essentially the UBI or URI rather is sustaining. Let's say hypothetically 5% of the total value of the economy is redistributed every year through this mechanism. So that's all property, real estate, that's commodities, that's money, that's all of these different, the entire economy. Imagine that. So if everyone's getting a lot redistributed and then produces less, eventually over years there's less to go around, and then people have to start producing more again. So it uses free market mechanisms to balance out whether or not essentially whether or not the URI is enough to totally survive off. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's all these different. You got to read like 10 books, Like I feel. How would they start it? Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, that's the hope. My hope, but that's because I think that people can coexist peacefully without nation states. But that's a great question. How would you start it? How would you start it? Right. Yeah. So essentially, what you need to do this on a blockchain network like EOS is a mechanism for verifying someone's a person. They call that strong identity, and we haven't really seen that solved yet in the blockchain industry. And so the reason you need that is because these are open networks that anyone can connect to and interact with. So what's to stop me from faking like I'm 10 people or 100 or 1,000,000? And then so they call that gaming the system. And if the system gets gamed, then the whole thing won't work. So we need a way to say, okay, you're a person, so you get one share of the earth and its resources. And, a person can't falsely claim 10 or 100 shares of the earth. And that's kind of like why we haven't seen URI through a blockchain mechanism deployed yet. But people are really trying to solve that one because you also need to solve that problem to do democratic voting through these software systems. So, yeah. Who wants the mic next? Here you go.
Hey, I just want to say that I believe until, like you said, until we're able to overcome the government trying to stop us from accomplishing this type of goal, I don't see how it's going to happen. You know what I'm saying? Because just with taxes alone, that's something that we are built in our head that we have to do. Where we actually don't have to do it, and we all collectively be like, I'm not paying taxes. They can't throw everybody in jail. You know what I'm saying? But they know that enough people are scared to go to jail that enough people not going to do that, or we're not going to collectively say, I'm not actually have the power if we wanted to stop paying taxes, but we all will have to do it together. You know what I'm saying? Until then, they're still going to keep control because as long as they know you have to pay or do what we say, or we're going to throw you in jail, none of this is really going to matter.
Yeah, so I think what Dan's getting at is just because you were here first doesn't mean you get everything. But I mean, if we look at wealth distribution over time, certainly no, they didn't. No, yeah, and let's look at a context of like I don't know, 200 years or 300 years. So multiple, I don't know how many generations that is, maybe five. Um, so and you know obviously there's all these migrations of people. There's forced migrations through slavery. There's all kinds of horrible people moving around, pushing out existing indigenous populations, like you know the colonization of the U.S. And people just claiming land and resources and saying that's mine now. And I think Dan's like basically asserting that's not okay and that's not sustainable. And you know, if everyone puts their flag in the ground and says this is my 5 acres 200 years ago, but people keep dying and being born, then what's left for the newborns? So the idea is over time the scales need to be rebalanced for the new people on Earth, and that's where that 5% or inflation of all of the whole economy comes into play. Because if you're making your resources that you've got, your property productive, then you may be creating wealth, you may be creating jobs. It's not idle resources that are just sitting there like like 100-acre plot of land that's not being used but no one can go on it because it's private property. So the idea, I think, is and this goes back to economic philosophies. If resources are being made more productive, then the overall boon for everyone's theoretically would be higher, but there's social injustice, systemic injustice. So it's one dimension and one lens, and yeah, that's the idea. Is just because you're first doesn't mean you get everything, or just because you hit some opportunity, you hit the jackpot 300 years ago, doesn't mean your family gets to be a dynasty. They still have to work hard through their lifetimes to contribute back to society too.
I was just wondering, these ideas, how do you get past, how do you incorporate this into the thinking of the average American? Because, I grew up in poverty in Detroit, and, a series of events, I was able to actually go to college. But once I got employment, I felt a huge amount of pressure. So I had grown up in Detroit in poverty, huge amount of pressure to leave, to move, um, leave Detroit because, you've made it now. You've made it now, and you are different than the people there, and, my children, I remember, so my husband, he, when we got married, we lived in Detroit. We live in Detroit still. But when we had children, I'm a real big advocate for public education. I was actually a teacher in Detroit. My very first day, when I was in school, when on my job, a teacher came up to me and said, you don't have to send your kids here. You don't have to send your kids to Detroit. I decided to send my children to public school because, again, I believe in public education. I believe it's the only, you know, abandoning. I was told that I don't care about my children. You put your money where you know, you show. If you cared about them, you put your money from. They go to private school. If you it's all this. It's like going to the casino. There's some jackpots, but most people. So I think this country throws a few people a few crumbs, and it gets them to believe and separate their interests from the majority and the mass of humanity. And so, it's this philosophy that you have to use somebody as a footstool for you to get ahead. And once you're out, well, even the weird thing is that even when you have all these thoughts, but the more success you have, it's this idea that you are so different, you know, and this idea that you did it, everyone can do it. It's their fault. They're lazy. They're this. They're that. So it's this idea ingrained in society that I just, I, you know, getting past that in people is, you know, I don't see how things go unless the mindset of people changes to care about their fellow man. I don't.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that point. I think like in a lot of the systems that we are experimenting with and pioneering now, there isn't a component of education that's built in, and that's something that we're gonna have to figure out in order for them to take us where we want to go. The other thing that I was thinking is that one of the things I didn't hear you guys mention were that there are these actual physical projects of Exodus, and that historically, when people couldn't achieve freedom in the society that they were in, they actually physically got up and left. And I think that's your kind of like that's your final card, right? Like you actually got to be willing to get up and go and choose to live and be free. So there are currently projects uh, going on involving things like seasteading. If you guys have heard of seasteading, so the idea is that here on this planet, the sea is the final frontier, where people are actually going and building ocean-based cities, and these some of these projects are funded by crypto. Um, that's just one example. Another example is what Elon Musk is doing, trying to make humanity into an interplanetary species. Um, and it's not a coincidence that Consensus bought planetary resources. So there are people who are thinking about this in a real physical, like literally exodusing out of the existing system and going and building a new society. And I think that concept of going to the wilderness, to the frontier, that as your mechanism for liberating yourself, I think is pretty important. Of course, a lot of us think about this in the context of the electronic frontier, but this is also a real like physical thing. With that pattern, you do see that when people leave and go somewhere new, often they are hostile either to the people that are already there or to the ecosystem that exists there. But there are also counterexamples. I think one of the best examples is the founding of Rhode Island. The guy who founded Rhode Island integrated incredibly well with the indigenous people in the area. He left the Massachusetts Bay Colony because he could not achieve religious freedom there, which is ironic because this was meant to be a space for people who could not achieve religious freedom where they were. So he in turn left the Massachusetts Bay Colony and became sort of integrated with the indigenous peoples and started Rhode Island. And while we often do see that recurring flaw in this pattern, it doesn't mean that we have to repeat it in our next step. That's what I think.
I had I think everybody here brought up a lot of real good points, and as far as basing it off of the core of tonight, which was defining sort of economic equality, um, and sort of what I said earlier about you have to redefine wealth or value, and then you mix in that with I think this gentleman was talking about as far as well he was saying about my value isn't necessarily your value. Then Kennard's point about language barriers. The most monumental book I ever read. It's actually a dual thing is Animal Farm in 1984, where you have Newspeak, where you control what people think, you control people. So I mean, you're dead on with that aspect. But and then when it comes to the communities, from basing off of education, universal basic income, universal resource, and one of the reasons I've attracted towards blockchain technology. I think Bitcoin being the first example, and there's been several others since then. It builds that community. So whether you're talking, it builds an exodus for you. We have the internet. The internet is a tool for us to build communities the way we sort of want to self-see the community. You know what I mean? It can get capitalism. I'm a capitalist myself. I believe in the capitalist system, but it has all the flaws that everybody brought up. And it took over the internet. Facebook started off as it was actually a good thing. I remember when Facebook first opened up to the public. I was one of the first people on it. I thought it was a good thing. I haven't been on Facebook now in like 6 years because I can't stand what it is. But that's because you let the bad parts of capitalism take over, right? And with the right technologies for that uprising, I think he left. With the right technologies, you can build that sort of community that's sort of geared towards what you want, what you see as something basic, as something valuable, right? And you can build these communities. I'm sure y'all maybe we'll get into it, but there's systems to build, autonomous communities where you have control of your own information. So when you're talking about things about money, getting rid of physical cash and going to digital currencies, you're right. If it tracks you, I hate that I have to swipe a Visa every time I want to buy a bottle of water with a card. I ask Visa permission to use my own money. Can I please drink? That's ludicrous. So when you take those systems, and especially the monetary system, and put it back in your own hands, and then you decide as a community how you're going to distribute it, how you're going to value it, then you start to see all these systems shift and change. You don't necessarily have to go live underwater to do it, although that might not be so bad if we can get the plastic out of it, right? But I think that's really the key, is going back to your very basic needs, what are your very basics. Allow people the freedom to achieve whatever their value of success is, which again was said tonight. And that's how you get economic equality, because now we all are equal in finding our own route to happiness.
Yeah, I'm just. I think I've read about a lot of different cryptocurrencies and kind of like understand the premise of EOS, but at the end of the day, I've always been confused about how we get to functional use cases, and wondering if any of the representatives of EOS can talk about like individual projects that have functioned with EOS and how they're going and what's going on with EOS Detroit as a structure.
Thanks for asking that. So I think the question was, what what functional use cases exist today, and also what is EOS Detroit doing to make these technologies a reality? So today, mostly on EOS, as Ingrid mentioned, it's about 7 months old now, so it's a pretty young blockchain. Bitcoin just had its 10th birthday, so EOS is 20 times younger, roughly. So what we see in EOS today are really simple use cases. Games are huge. So there's a lot of games. We see game studios actually developing on EOS, and they're really interested in creating new ways that the economies within games can manifest outside of the game world. So there's interesting use cases there. I think it's good that games are first, because we can test out things in a low-stake environment with games. You can test out things like URI in a game and other experiments, and it doesn't have to put people at risk of being guinea pigs in an experiment. So that's what we're kind of seeing unfold at the broader level, or globally in EOS. And there's a lot of other really interesting use cases, social networks and exchanges, and the sort of the things you may expect if like you said, you've studied blockchains. So there's a lot of like use cases, whether it's medical records or figuring out new ways that people's social information can be valued. As far as EOS Detroit goes, we're really interested in the concept of dynamic ownership. So our venture is owned by everyone on the team, and we're creating software to make it easier for ventures to create fair ownership allocations and manage them. So they call it dynamic equity splitting. And we're also working, Nate and Ingrid both alluded to it earlier, with the autonomous communities. We're focused on a local currency concept here for the region, and essentially tying that to a utility, internet access. So solving the pain of cheap internet access in a city like Detroit, which is a multi-organizational project. We work with Detroit Blockchain Center on that, which Nate leads up. So we've got a few irons in the fire, and I think over the next year or two, we'll really see some larger scale apps come out that are ready for lots of people to join. And so part of what we struggle with, we're really excited about what's going on, but it feels still kind of early. It's not too early to start talking, but we don't want to give people a bad first impression because the technology's not ready either.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
So there's a couple examples of what's being tested right now. In Montreal, there's Eva, which is like an Uber, except it doesn't have that central company of Uber. And so each driver it has actually been vetted by Uber, but then they can use Eva and just get have partial ownership of this kind of rideshare company.
Yeah, it's a co-op structure.
Yeah, it's a co-op structure. There's also Everipedia. One of the co-founders of Wikipedia has created Everipedia, and it basically is the same thing as a Wikipedia, except you I think you stake your own EOS tokens to write your entry, and I think once a certain amount of people accept it or something, and then you're able to earn tokens in some way, shape, or form.
They've
and
got their own token called IQ.
You can sign up for that now. And you can also sign up for Karma, which is a social network that basically rewards you for doing good deeds. So you can, instead of a like, you can get some Karma tokens. So those are some examples. They're in process right now. But like we said, EOS is new. We're still building and growing. And the internet initiative that we were looking at, we've been inspired by the Equitable Internet Initiative. For those of you who don't know about that, they're basically working in 3 neighborhoods here, Island, North End, and Southwest. And they're putting up a mesh network, an antenna on one house that bounces a signal to an antenna on another house. And then everyone in that area has access to free Wi-Fi. Sorry, not free Wi-Fi, but Wi-Fi at a lower cost, and it's faster. I think I want it to be free, like deep down inside. And I keep saying, what? Oh, wow. So those families that can't afford it will get it at no cost. So that's really dope to hear. So that's the Equitable Internet Initiative. It's on the resource sheet if you want to learn more about it and support it.